Hey everyone! For this next session, we're going to talk a bit about navigating the evolution of monitoring. I'm joined by two wonderful panelists, Sarah Morgan of TelemetryHub and Freedom Dumlao of Flexcar. Tell us a little bit more about yourselves. Let's start with Sarah.
Sure. My name is Sarah Morgan. I run product at TelemetryHub. I've been in software for about 18 years now, which is crazy, but have just spent the last year or so really kind of diving deep into kind of monitoring and dusting off my old ops days and getting up to speed.
Right on. Freedom?
Yeah, I'm Freedom. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Flexcar, which is formerly a part of Zipcar. I've spent also, like Sarah, the better part of the last 2 decades building and shipping software. Uh, Built big stuff at companies like Amazon and worked with tons of startups to ship cool products as well. And yeah, excited to be here and talking with you today.
Very cool. Very cool. So we've kind of got like a list of questions we're going to go through, and we'll kind of adjust and people answer and jump in and stuff like that. But I think one of the things that we really want to start off with is how do you define what monitoring in the context of microservices and distributed systems? How do you define what that means?
So I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in when we start to talk about observability, because we've kind of muddied the waters a little bit. I think that traditional monitoring really applied to your physical servers where you were able to plug in a monitor and set up your monitoring and understand what you're looking at. And today's distributed systems really require a lot more than that to tie it all together because of the distributed part of that. So we've, introduced this new term called observability, but really what it is it's just like the right monitoring for the architecture that we have today.
Right on, right on. And how do you feel like, it seems to me that monitoring has been a thing for a long time. I mean, there's been companies that have been out there doing it for a while, but like you said, it's changed somewhat. Like first of all, we call it observability. I also think there's a lot more things that you could see. But what are, like, say, in the past decade, some of the main drivers of this evolution? Like, what's the real catalyst behind it?
I think really what has driven it is the move towards cloud and microservices has really changed the way engineering teams are organized. So if you're organized around a functional area and you can't hold like your whole architecture and code base in your head, or like step through an application in one place, you really need to be able to understand what's going on elsewhere without having like prior knowledge of it. And I think that's really been the main driver. It's just that the complexity that's been introduced with these new systems.
Right. Now, I mean, I think complexity is really the new term, because we used to focus, at least in my day, and we can tell from the whiteness of the beard that was a long time ago. But, we used to have these giant monolithic systems that were running on IIS on a Dell computer. But I mean, like, they were complex, but they were like stupidly complex. Now we have like serious complexity with microservice architectures. And what are some of like the biggest challenges that an organization faces when it comes to things like monitoring in this modern environment? Freedom, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, as we've decoupled systems and started to create these more distributed systems, all of a sudden, what you're starting to see is you've got this architecture that you planned to solve one problem, but now just you suddenly find out practically any service can call any other service to get data. And you start to see some emergent behaviors and patterns that maybe you didn't plan for and you couldn't plan for right in advance. And you get surprised because you'll have maybe a small niche service that you created that was supposed to solve some small problem for someone somewhere. And then all of a sudden another team discovers like, oh, there's a service that does this. And now they're jumping on and taking advantage of this service. And now this small service that wasn't really intended to be a part of the critical path for anyone has become core to what the business is doing. And so making sure that you're in a position to discover that problem or discover that challenge before it becomes a business problem is really important. And I think that's something that's changed quite a bit, because you used to really see everything coming through this one path. Now you're going to be surprised sometimes as your architecture grows, where those paths are and how it's changing.
Interesting. And I think that we're talking about evolution, like how did we get to where we are now? But in reality, like there's also a where are we going to go next? But in order to understand that, we kind of have to understand what we're doing right now. So how important is observability in microservices and distributed systems, and how does that differ from what we traditionally think of as monitoring?
I mean, I think it's critically important. And I think that we're at this inflection point right now where we're doing a million different things, trying to come to an agreement on what we should be doing. So I think standardization is really going to be kind of the future of observability. But I think right now it's really a little bit of everybody's trying something different to see what works, right? And that's when you see like projects like the Open Telemetry project trying to start to set some standards, and that evolved out of some other open source projects that were kind of doing the same thing. Now you're thinking about bringing 3 independent telemetry signals all together into one, single pane of glass, quote unquote. And I think that's really going to be the future, because I think it's really about being able to see everything in the same place with that context that you need to be able to understand what's happening, so that you're not just jumping from place to place and kind of using hypotheses to figure out what's happening.
Right on. And how do you kind of balance that need for visibility into those distributed systems with a need to maintain security and privacy? I know that, there was always kind of if we didn't build it here, fear when it came to monitoring and observability and a lot of other, phases of the DevOps cycle. But it also seems like, there's an issue, especially now when people are concerned, where's my data going? Is it encrypted end to end? Where do we find that balance to be able to see into these distributed systems, but also we're able to kind of keep things behind our own fence and keep things private?
Yeah, there's a lot of components of this, but for me, I think when you're talking about security and privacy, what we're talking about is protecting our customers and our users, and that's the most important thing, right? Second to that, and obviously, and a close second, is protecting our business. But starting from protecting our users, the most important thing is being really thoughtful about what information you're allowing to traverse your services, both internally and on the wire. Like, what data are you sending around? And there's a time in the past, those of us who've been doing this for a couple of decades, when we might have felt safe or okay in using, say, a customer's email address and using that as the ID to send that around. Those days are long gone, and for
To say
those
the
of us
least.
yeah, for those of us who are interested in making sure that our customers are protected, what you do is you simply don't share in terms of your monitoring and logging and anything that you're doing that keep track of what's happening in your systems. You should just never have PII in there. Just be really thoughtful, and that means that names, email addresses, all the stuff that is legally classified as PII, and then all of the stuff that by common sense tells you is PII. Instead, just use an identifier that can easily be disconnected from a human being and doesn't automatically identify somebody in the system. If you start there or in early days, or if you start now, even if you've already begun the path and you're trying to get cleaned up, the sooner you can, the quicker you'll be able to realize that this is not a big challenge. It's actually quite easy to do. And your customers, of course, will be protected, and you'll still be able to manage and keep your systems healthy.
Right on. And just for clarification, just because I always, whenever there's an acronym, I like to make sure everybody knows. Personal identifying information, correct? What's what you mean by PII?
That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Sorry for the jargon.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I mean, it's just you never know. I like to, especially conferences like this, we like to keep it as open as possible. So for the beginners, now you know what PII is. For the experts, you've been reinforced. What role? So, I mean, we kind of have the idea of security and the balance, but like, what role do metrics, logging, and tracing play when it comes to like a modern monitoring approach? And like, how do you even figure out what's appropriate? I know that people often talk about like, oh, you only look for the things you know to look for, and how do you figure out like what should I be looking for? What's outside of my field of vision? How do you figure out what's going on, and where do all these things kind of come into play when it comes to observability?
Yeah, so the metrics, logs, and traces are the 3 pillars that observability is built upon, and you can argue that's more of like the tactical side of observability. It differs a bit from the philosophy of observability, which is like building your team and your code to be always thoughtful of making observable systems. But I read something recently, and I cannot attribute it to the right person because I can't remember where I read it, but they said that it's not like you need a third logs, a third metrics, and a third distributed traces to achieve 100% observability. It's really going to be unique from case to case. So if you're thinking about like, a traditional monolithic system, maybe you're using observability tools, but what you really need potentially are just metrics and logs, right? Like that distributed tracing isn't going to be as valuable as it would be somewhere where you're using like serverless architecture or have a very distributed system, making a lot of like third-party calls and that sort of thing. Then you could rely really heavily on traces for your alerting and also for your troubleshooting. So, I think that's one thing people really need to keep in mind is that there's not a good one size fits all here. There's some huge players in the space and there's some really awesome small like host it yourself solutions. And it's really, I think, a good idea to be very pragmatic about it and make sure that you're getting the right size and the right fit for your team and your organization.
Right. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that because it somewhat reminds me of there was a period of time where people were like, oh, we need more, we need more analytics. We need things like that. Let's get a Hadoop cluster. And that was like the default answer. It's like, maybe you don't need a Hadoop cluster. Maybe you just need a fairly decent database setup. It's one of those odd things, but there's always those challenges when you talk about what's the right size. How do I right size my software for our solution or my product or our company? Like, how do you deal with the challenges of scale and performance when it comes to monitoring essentially distributed systems? Like we're not in that monolith space anymore where we can say, okay, I'm just going to point it at, website.com and I'm going to know exactly what's going on because website.com is, again, sitting in a Dell Blade server with poor ventilation in a closet somewhere in this building. You literally can't go and monitor your servers anymore. We live in the cloud now. So how do you face those challenges when it's time to scale and worry about performance to make sure that your applications are properly running the way they should?
I mean, even though we've moved into a world where your code could literally be running practically anywhere. I mean, I've seen people running startups where they've just got a cluster of Raspberry Pis set up in an office somewhere, and then of course there's a lot of great no server or serverless systems out there that people are running on as well. And then if you haven't heard of Kubernetes, it's a pretty popular way to run some stuff these days.
Oh, is that a thing? Nobody ever talks about it.
Yeah, you should definitely Google that. It's pretty interesting. But yeah, so your code can run anywhere. But the thing that hasn't changed since the beginning days of what we used to just call logging before we even called it monitoring is those operations have got to be non-blocking. Like you've got to make it so that whatever is happening, your application's job is to do a thing, and monitoring the thing itself isn't the thing. So that's got to be something that can fail without having the system itself fail. Now, what that means, though, is that you probably need to monitor your monitors a little bit just in case those start to fail. You want to get some advanced warning of that. But you can't let the system fail because the monitoring is failing. And if you start there with that sort of non-blocking mentality in the way that you implement those things, you're going to be way ahead of the game in terms of supporting scale. And you'll find that you can probably get pretty far with that.
Right on. And I mean, I think that there's always new things coming to this space. I know that, the folks behind SPOTcon are huge on like OTel and things like that. Sarah, maybe you could speak a little bit more about, when it comes to the monitoring space, what are some of the emerging technologies and trends that are like super exciting, or at least maybe I always feel like exciting is a loaded word. I mean, we build websites, folks. Let's not get too out of hand. But like, what's promising? What's new and cool and kind of fun that people can look forward to?
Yeah, I'll double down on the OpenTelemetry as being the most exciting emerging technology in observability. I think what is so amazing about this project, and Frida mentioned Kubernetes, OpenTelemetry is the second most active project in CNCF after Kubernetes. So, it's got traction. It's not like a new, maybe it's going to be cool someday. Like it's already kind of caught the attention of a lot of the big players. But I think what is so great about it is that it doesn't have to be like incredibly difficult. So, you can get Kubernetes metrics out of the box by deploying an OpenTelemetry collector within your cluster. And that is awesome, right? Like it doesn't take a lot of know-how to do this. So if you're a small kind of scrappy team of engineers with no like focused DevOps roles, this is still available to you. So I always say like the best time to start monitoring your systems was yesterday. And if you're not doing that, then do it today, because you can build monitoring debt. And it's, it's like tech debt. You're making yourself vulnerable if you don't have that implemented. So, I think a project like OpenTelemetry is a really good way to go, because it's open source. You can contribute to it. If there's gaps that you see that aren't meeting your needs, it's really well supported with a really enthusiastic base. So for me, that's been the most exciting thing I've seen, along with all of the projects that have come out of it that support it. There's projects like ours, TelemetryHub. There's a lot of stuff that you can kind of host yourself, which I think is always great, especially when price is a concern. So, I think it's really driving some really cool innovation.
Very cool. Let me ask a little bit of a follow-up, because I know that the idea of having monitoring observability tools that are open source isn't super new. We had other options that were available before, and we actually had companies that were built completely around them. Things like the Elk Stack, but everybody would say, well, the problem with the Elk Stack is you end up having someone who's running the Elk Stack by themselves, and that becomes their full-time job. What do tools that have kind of like the larger community, the larger group of stakeholders, more or less, out there, where do they benefit from, that open source mentality? Like, OpenTelemetry is part of the CNCF. Do you think that helps, to provide a safer, better, easier to use environment where people don't have to suddenly take full-time jobs and it can just become a part of an environment? Or do you think it's still nascent and we have yet to figure out where that's all going to land?
I think so. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and people feel very confident with open source today. Like it's, we've gotten to a place where we're not as concerned about open source leaving us open to, privacy threats and that sort of thing. So I think the confidence is there. I think the fact that it's part of CNCF kind of doubles down that confidence for a lot of people. And I think that moving to more of a culture of like, I'm an engineer on a team, I'm writing code, I'm thinking about making this code observable using the tools that I have available to me, one of them being OpenTelemetry, distributes that responsibility instead of having it be something that is tacked on at the end, which can be so hard to do. Great if you have the resources and the bandwidth to do it, but if you can just have everybody kind of own it, which I know is not always everybody's favorite thing, but then you're getting it done at the time that the thought of the business logic is happening, right? Like I know what I'm trying to do with this, so therefore I can instrument it in a way that's useful instead of coming back a year later and being like, what even matters here at this point?
Right. And it kind of ties into avoiding that pitfall, so to speak, of I've developed this code, and I'm going to worry about what I want to look for later. That, I'm going to look for what I want to look for, not I'm going to look for what I need to be looking for. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in a sense, like there's always, pitfalls and things like that. So, how can organizations ensure that they're getting like the most value from their monitoring efforts? And what are some of the common pitfalls that people need to avoid?
Yeah, there's a couple of parts of this. And I think since Sarah, since you were just talking about OpenTelemetry, I'll probably start there, and even just tack on a little bit to PJ, what you were talking about. We do have a world. I mean, Elk Stack hasn't gone anywhere, right? Like it's still totally available to us, and we can set it up and pay somebody to run it for us, or try our best to manage it ourselves. There's a real difference I see as an engineering leader in making a bet on Elk Stack versus making a bet on something like OpenTelemetry. Elk Stack and the technologies that make up Elk Stack are great tools, and really have helped push the envelope into what's possible, especially for companies that couldn't afford more expensive solutions. But they still do kind of lock you in, right? You still have to operate. You're still using that tech and those tools. And what OpenTelemetry gives you the ability to do is to make a choice that you can start working with one set of tools now. And if you outgrow those tools without having a major lift, without having to re-architect or re-implement your monitoring and observability solution, you can transition to another tool when that time comes. And that flexibility and that kind of future proofing is really important. I think the other things in terms of getting value out of your monitoring efforts is you've got to be, PJ, you were just kind of alluding to this, you got to be intentional about what you're monitoring. And to me, that starts with, for an organization, even a young organization that's just building out its first few services, decide what are the things that every service, regardless of what this service is going to do, what are the things I'm going to measure on that service. So, typically you'll want to measure things like error rates. You're going to want to measure throughput and latency. Maybe you're going to want to measure some memory usage depending on your deployment scenario. So define what that is and say, these are the things we're always going to measure, and maybe even make yourself a little tool to automatically drop that stuff in on your on any new service you create. And then for every service you make, there's going to be some unique thing about that service that you'll want to measure as well. And then lastly, to make that stuff mean anything at all, you need to set some SLAs. If you just measure stuff, but you don't have any mechanism for being accountable to when those measurements say, like, hey, this is getting slow, or this is getting a little hairy for us. If you don't have an SLA in place, you really don't know when you're supposed to do anything as an organization. So defining SLAs early on, even if you have no idea, right, what the usage patterns are going to be, set some bar and say, when this bar is exceeded, I'm going to pay attention and see if I can change it, and then continuously work to improve that bar to make it so that the latency gets better or memory usage goes down. Always seek to see if you can improve that a little bit as you continue to release software in that service. So those are the key areas, I think, that you'd start out with in terms of your value journey.
Oh, you're muted, PJ.
We'll fix that in post. I'm going to start asking some questions that are on the list because we still have like 8 or 9 minutes to fill.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting what you say there, Freedom, and I think that kind of leads us to another question when we look at, because we kind of mentioned things like Elk Stack and in the past difficult, cantankerous, open source but not super open to use. Now we have Open Telemetry, which is part of this like CNCF ecosystem, like an open source ecosystem, if you will. What is kind of the future? What is like monitoring observability when it comes to what is the next step in evolution? What is the singularity of monitoring, if you will? And Sarah, if you want to jump in, you can feel free to jump.
Yeah.
I know that's a super hard question.
No, I actually have I'll tell you, PJ, that one of the things that businesses are starting to encounter more and more is that we don't own all of our software. In fact, we don't operate all of our software, right? When I'm delivering a solution to a customer today, part of that is technology that my team builds, and part of that is technology that I've purchased from somebody else, and they're operating it for me, right? They're some software as a service platform that's giving me some additional capability that I didn't have the resources to build. And as I'm delivering services to my customer and trying to keep myself accountable to the SLAs that I've set, there's this underlying software that I have very little visibility into. And I think the future, as we open up and create some more and continue to evolve the standards, is going to allow me as a person who's producing software for my customer to get some observability into the systems of the dependencies at other companies that I depend on, so that I can see problems coming even sooner before they become a problem, before they become a failure. I think that's realistic, and I think companies, just like in the past where we've seen companies that establish themselves as a platform tend to win in this market. I think being a platform is going to mean providing access to some of the monitoring and observability metrics of the systems that you're making available to your customers.
Awesome. Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
I guess in a little bit of a different spin on where we're headed, I really think it's going to be about consolidation. I think people are getting a bit of fatigue with all of the different tools that they're using. And I think it is going to be about kind of platforming some of those tools, like Freedom said, instead of having like a whole arsenal of things that you're having to manage, having kind of one place that you go to for your pre-production and your post-production monitoring. Interesting.
Now, one of the things that we've kind of talked about, I wouldn't say we skirted around, we stepped right in it. But do you think that in some ways Freedom, you mentioned the software as a service and platforms as a service kind of model being a thing. Do you think that a lot of that is becoming similar to the open source movement, where it's kind of like, hey, I just want to build what my core business logic is, and I don't really want to worry about all the other stuff. So I'll use OTel for my monitoring. I'll use Kubernetes for my deployment. I'll use AWS to actually put something out into the world, or maybe GPC. Not everybody wants to use AWS, but they do, but they don't. But like, do you think that in some ways what we're seeing now is kind of a technological move towards a more open environment where it's kind of like, hey, I don't need to do that whole, if it's not built here, we don't use it kind of thing. I can build components and hold on to my core business logic. And as a corollary to that, do you think that other companies would be like, hey, then I can start open sourcing some of the things that we are building that aren't necessarily core to that? And we actually see a greater, more open environment out there.
Yeah, I think we are. So I hope we'll see it become more open. But what I do think we see is businesses in general are becoming more open to the idea that the software that runs their business isn't entirely built in-house. And the realities are engineering resources tend to be fairly precious. And if you are spending money to have engineers build software for you, the most value you're going to get is having those engineers building software that is core to your business, that's part of your secret sauce. And whenever your engineers start building something that is really not your business's core competency, you're starting to leak a little bit of the value there. And I think businesses have started to wake up to this and started to become more open to the idea of finding a provider who can give me access to a great suite of tools or a great platform to solve the problem in a way that honestly I wouldn't invest in myself. And that's just something that started picking up steam, probably about a decade ago, and I think is fully snowballed now. And I think you'll see most companies today embracing this ideology.
Yeah, I will add to that as a product manager. Anytime I'm doing like a build versus buy analysis on, some feature work, if I can find something that I can purchase that fits my budget and fits, nicely into my product plan, I will go that way 100% of the time, because not only do I not have to spend my engineering resources on building something that they don't specialize in and I may not have the expertise in, but they don't have to support it. And that's such a hard thing. Like, it's sometimes you can build something that you then can't support because you don't totally understand what it's doing. And, just being able to offload that to somebody else, I think is amazing.
Absolutely. And I think it shows the value of the technology we build. So I think we're coming up just about on time. We'll start with Sarah. Any final thoughts on the whole nature of navigating the evolution of monitoring?
I would say, again, I kind of mentioned it before, but sort of evaluate where you are. And if you're finding gaps in your tools today and you're not getting the alerts that you need when something goes wrong, you're hearing from your customers that there are problems before you know about them, I think it's a good time to kind of take a step back and evaluate your monitoring and see if it needs a little bit of a more modern push into observability or just better implementation. Because again, like that monitoring debt, you just don't want to dig yourself into a hole, because it really does kind of leave you open for disaster potentially.
Absolutely. Freedom?
Yeah, I think just be super intentional, be thoughtful. Don't fall into the trap that some of us have fallen into, where we just take all the data we can and dump it because we've been fooled into believing that that's actually cheap, because then you end up with a mess to try to untangle and make sense of later. Be thoughtful about it, and you'll find the value there.
Awesome. So I just want to say thank you both so much. I know you both have your Twitter handles on the screen. If anyone wanted to get a hold of you, they have questions, they want to follow you on social media, they'd like to find out more about your dietary habits on Instagram, where can folks follow you?
I usually tell people just to hit me up on email. This Twitter handle is our company handle, because my Twitter is really just retweeting this for the most part, and then sometimes complaining about public transportation. But I am Sarah at TelemetryHub.com, and I'm always happy to chat. And I have a very common name, so that's easier than trying to find me on LinkedIn or anything.
And unlike Sarah, my name is super Googleable, so you will have no trouble finding me on the internet. My apologies for anyone who stumbles across an image of me with a mohawk. Those days are long gone, obviously, but
Same.
API guy everywhere. But also, if you look up Freedom Dumlao, you'll find me on LinkedIn pretty easily as well.
Awesome. Freedom and Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you both again for joining us for SPOTcon 2023. And everybody who's watching, stick around. We'll have more great talks in just a few minutes.